My dear students and viewers, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to my online class. I am Murshida Imam, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Govt Shahid, Suhrawardy College, Dhaka. My dear students, today I will continue a class for the students of Honours 4th year on the topic Sons and Lovers. My dear students, you know, in our previous class we completed Part 1, Chapter 1 of the novel Sons and Lovers, named the early married life of the morals. And today we will read Part 1, Chapter 2. The title of Chapter 2 is The Birth of Paul and Another Battle. And the students, you know, Part 1 of the novel is written in the manner of Victorian realism. The omniscient narrator, working with firm control, sets forth the facts objectively. The countryside, the mining village, the family conflicts, the daily life of the household, all is given in clear, precise, convincing detail. The use of local dialect, the echoes of biblical style, the short, concise sentences combine to create in us a confidence in the narrator's command of his materials. His fairness to everyone is evident. My dear students, and we watch morals relish in getting his breakfast, and his joy in walking across the fields to his work in the early morning. We learn of those happy times when Morel is cobbling the family's boots, or mending kettles, or making fuses. We recognize his faithful labor at his grueling job, and particularly we notice the love for him felt by the youngest child, Arthur. Mrs. Morel was glad this child loved the father. All these things give a sense of balance and proportion to Part 1, making it clear that Paul's view is partial, unfair to the father, ignoring his basic humanity. Now, my dear students, go to Part 1, Chapter 2 of the novel Sons and Lovers. Open your textbook, please, and start doing the class. In Part 1, Chapter 1, we saw that there was a quarrel between Mr. and Mrs. Morel. And now the starting line of Part 2 of the novel, The Birth of Paul and Another Battle, is like that. After such a scene as the last, Walter Morel was for some days abashed and ashamed, but he soon regained his old bullying indifference. Yet there was a slight shrinking, a diminishing in his assurance. Physically even he shrunk, and his fine full presence waned. He never grew in the least stout, so that as he sank from his erect, assertive bearing, his physique seemed to contract along with his pride and moral strength. So here we see that Mr. Morel, that is Walter Morel, Morel's physical appearance seems to diminish. Okay, and we also see that though he became ashamed for the quarrel, but though he was ashamed, he again began to misbehave with his wife. And here we also see the that is the next para. If we read the next para, but now he realized how hard it was for his wife to drag about at her work, and his sympathy, quickened by penitence, hastened forward with his help. He came straight home from the pit and stayed in at evening till Friday, and then he could not remain at home, but he was back again by 10 o'clock, almost quite sober. So here we see that he sometimes he became sympathized with his wife, but when he came home late and after drinking a lot, he misbehaved with his wife, that is with Gertrude Morel. And here we in this chapter we see that he realizes her difficulties and begins to be helpful to his wife sometimes. Okay, he made his own breakfast, that is, he always made his own breakfast. Being a man who rose early and had plenty of time, he did not, as some miners do, drag his wife out of bed at 6 o'clock. At 5 sometimes earlier, he woke, got straight out of bed and went downstairs. When she could not sleep, his wife lay waiting for this time. As for a period of peace, the only real rest seemed to be when he was out of the house. So here we see that Mr. Morel, that is Walter Morel, always made his own breakfast, and but when he got out of the house, then Mrs. Morel could rest really. Okay, and he went downstairs in his shirt and then struggled into his pit trousers, which were left on the hearth to warm all night. There was always a fire because Mrs. Morel raked, and the first sound in the house was the bang bang of the poker against the raker as Morel smashed the remainder of the coal to make the kettle, which was filled and left on the hob, finally boil. That is, we find here the description of the morning of the Morel family here. Okay, and in this chapter we will see that Mrs. Morel took help of his neighbors named Mrs. Kirk, okay, and Mrs. Bauer, midwife, and Mrs. Bauer first gave the news to Mr. Morel that Mrs. Morel gives birth to a child boy named that is Paul. Okay, and she becomes very ill after giving birth to the baby boy. Then we met another character, that is Mr. Hitton. Here we find that Mrs. Morel had a visit every day from the congregational clergyman Mr. Hitton. And how was Mr. Hitton? Yes, Mr. Hitton was young and very poor. His wife had died at the birth of his first baby, so he remained alone in the manse. He was a Bachelor of Arts of Cambridge, very shy and no preacher. Mrs. Morel was fond of him and he depended on her. For hours he talked to her when she was well. He became the godparent of the child. Then we see that Mr. Hitton became the godparent of the child, okay, of Mrs. Morel. And we'll also see that Mr. Morel is jealous of Mr. Hitton. He didn't like Mr. Hitton. And again we will find that Mr. Morel is also jealous of his son, that is William. Okay, and here in this chapter we'll see that Mrs. Morel is very much sympathized with Mr. Hitton, the congregational clergyman. From the dialogue of Mrs. Morel, we can get a clear idea about it. That is, Mrs. Morel thought to herself, "Yes, poor fellow, his young wife is dead. That is why he makes his love into the Holy Ghost." They were halfway down their first cup of tea when they heard the slaughter of pit boots. That is, when one day when Mr. Hitton was passing time in the Morel family, Mr. Morel came, and we see that when Mr. Morel came, he reacted against the clergyman, that is Mr. Hitton. When the clergyman Mr. Hitton asked Mr. Morel, "Are you tired?" asked the clergyman. "Tired? I am that," replied Morel. You don't know what it is to be tired, as I am tired. Here, the conversation between the clergyman, Mr. Hayton, and Mr. Morel. Through this conversation, we can easily guess that Mr. Morel didn't like the clergyman, Mr. Hayton. Mr. Morel again said to Mr. Hayton, that is, Mr. Hayton, he said, a man as has been down the black hole all day, dinging away at a cold face, yeah, a sight harder than that wall. Here, Mrs. Morel hated her husband because whenever he had an audience, he whined and played for sympathy. And William, sitting nursing the baby, hated him with a boy's hatred for false sentiment and for the stupid treatment of his mother. Annie had never liked him. She merely avoided him. So here you see that all of the family members of Morel family began to hate Mr. Morel. When the minister had gone, that is, the clergyman had gone, Mrs. Morel looked at her cloth. And here you see that she said, a fine mess. Dost think I am going to sit with my arms dangling? Cause thus got a person for tea with thee, he bawled. They were both angry, but she said nothing. The baby began to cry, and Mrs. Morel, picking up a saucepan from the heath, accidentally knocked Annie on the head. Whereupon the girl began to whine, and Morel to shout at her. In the midst of this pandemonium, William looked up at the big glazed text over the mantelpiece and read distinctly, God bless our home. Whereupon Mrs. Morel, trying to soothe the baby, jumped up, rushed at him, boxed his ears, saying, what are you putting in for? And then she sat down and laughed till tears ran over her cheeks, while William kicked the stool he had been sitting on, and Morel growled, I cannot see what there is so much to laugh at. And one evening, directly after the person's visit, that is, after the visit of the clergyman, feeling unable to bear herself after another display from her husband, she took Annie and the baby and went out. And Morel had kicked William, and the mother would never forgive him. So here we see that Morel was very much jealous of William, that is their first son. Okay, and he had kicked William, and the mother would never forgive him. So here we find that is Oedipus complex. The theme of Oedipus complex seems to be appear here. Okay. So after the quarrel with her babies, with Annie and William and the little boy, they all went to over the slip bridge and across a corner of the meadow to the cricket ground. And here we see that the description of the nature, that is, the meadow seemed one space of ripe evening light, whispering with the distant mill race. She sat on a seat under the alders in the cricket ground and fronted the evening. Before her, level and solid, spread the big green cricket field like the bed of a sheet of light. Children played in the bluish shadow of the pavilion. Many rooks high up came cawing home across the softly woven sky. They stooped in a long curve down into the golden glow, concentrating, cawing, wheeling like black flakes on a slow vortex over a tree clump that made a dark boss among the pasture. So here the description of nature is to be noted here, my dear students, and here at that moment we will see that that is at the very moment the Mrs. Morel, that is Gertrude Morel, has a sudden instinct to call him Paul, that is the baby boy which she gave birth. Now she looked at him and she felt an instinct to call him Paul, that is she named the boy Paul. Here, my dear students, then in this chapter, this is in the very chapter 2, we will see that the next major battle between the morals begins when Mr. Morel comes home late, drinking again. Okay, now we will read those lines for you. Here you see that Mrs. Morel was saying wearily to herself, that is, I wish the nuisance would come. And here again we see that the child at last sank down to sleep in her arms. She was too tired to carry him to the cradle. Here Mrs. Morel was saying that, but I will say nothing whatever time he comes. It only works me up. I won't say anything, but I know if he does anything, it will make my blood boil, she added to herself. And after coming home, that is, Mr. Morel asked, is there nothing to eat in the house? He asked insolently, as if to a servant. In certain stages of his intoxication, he affected the clipped, minching speech of the towns. Mrs. Morel hated him most in this condition. You know what there is in the house, she said, so coldly it sounded impersonal. He stood and glared at her without moving a muscle. I asked a civil question and I expect a civil answer, he said affectedly. And you got it, she said, still ignoring him. He glowered again, then he came unsteadily forward. He leaned on the table with one hand and with the other jerked at the table drawer to get a knife to cut bread. The drawer stuck because he pulled sideways. In a temper, he dragged it so that it flew out bodily, and spoons, forks, knives, and 100 metallic things splashed with a clatter and a clang upon the brick floor. The baby gave a little convulsed start. What are you doing, clumsy drunken fool? The mother cried. You see the conversation, that is the quarreling between husband and wife, that is Mr. Morel and Mrs. Morel. Okay, Mr. Morel, Mrs. Morel said, cried. The mother, that means here Mrs. Morel or Gertrude Morel, cried, what are you doing, clumsy drunken fool? So you see, now Mr. Morel is drunkard. Okay, he is so she called him drunken fool. Then thou should get the flaming thing, Thyssen, thou should get up like other women have to and wait on a man. Then Gertrude Morel replied, wait on you, she cried. Yes, I see myself. Yes, and I will learn thee, thus got to wait on me. Yes, thou shalt wait on me. Never, my lord, I would wait on a dog at the door first. So you see here the colloquial language, the Mr. Morel is using colloquial language. Okay, and here we see that Mrs. Morel is very much angry with her husband, and she's saying that she would wait on a dog at the door first, but not for her husband. So Mr. Morel is saying, what he was trying to fit in the drawer. At her last speech, he turned round. His face was crimson, his eyes bloodshot. He stared at her 1 silent second in dread. But she went quickly in contempt. He jerked at the drawer in his excitement. It fell, cut sharply on his shin, and on the reflex he flung it at her. One of the corners caught her brow as the shallow drawer crashed into the fireplace. She swayed, almost fell stunned from her chair. To her very soul she was sick. She clasped the child tightly to her bosom. A few moments elapsed. Then, with an effort, she brought herself to. The baby was crying plaintively. Her left brow was bleeding rather profusely. As she glanced down at the child, her brain reeling, some drops of blood soaked into his white shawl, but the baby was at least not hurt. She balanced her head to keep equilibrium so that the blood ran into her eyes. So here we find the description of the quarreling and battling between Mr. and Mrs. Morel. So, my dear students, here we see that the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Morel was not fine at all, and here once again we find a major quarrel between Mr. and Mrs. Morel. And after the quarreling, we see that Walter Morel lay in bed next day until nearly dinner time. That is, after the quarrel, he became silent and he didn't respond for some days. That is, he did not think of the previous evening's work. He scarcely thought of anything, but he would not think of that. He lay and suffered like a sulking dog. He had hurt himself most, and he was the more damaged because he would never say a word to her or express his sorrow. He tried to wriggle out of it. It was her own fault, he said to himself. Nothing, however, could prevent his inner consciousness inflicting on him the punishment which ate into his spirit like rust, and which he could only alleviate by drinking. So here we see that, my dear students, Mr. Morel could never confess his guilt. That is, he always thought that it was her own fault. That is, it was the fault of Gertrude Morel. It was the fault of his wife, not him. And he could only alleviate his he could only alleviate his every sorrow by drinking. Okay, so here you see that he again he went to the shop, that is the Palmerston Arms, okay, and to drink. And Sunday was the same, bed till noon, the Palmerston Arms till 2:30, dinner and bed, scarcely a word spoken. When Mrs. Morel went upstairs towards 4 o'clock to put her on her Sunday dress, he was fast asleep. She would have felt sorry for him if he had once said, "Wife, I am sorry," but no, he insisted to himself it was her fault, and so he broke himself. So she merely left him alone. There was this deadlock of passion between them, and she was stronger. So, my dear students, here we see that Mr. Morel once again went to Palmerston for some days. He began to drink once again. And here we also see that one night, however, he finds himself out of money and steals 6 pence from his wife's purse. Okay, so another fault of Mr. Morel we find here, that is, one night when he finds himself out of money and he had no money to drink, what did he do? He stole 6 pence from his wife's purse. Now we will read those lines, my dear students. On the Wednesday following, Morel was penniless. He dreaded his wife. Having hurt her, he hated her. He did not know what to do with himself that evening, having not even 2 pence with which to go to Palmerston, and being already rather deeply in debt. So, while his wife was down the garden with the child, he hunted in the top drawer of the dresser where she kept her purse, found it and looked inside. It contained a half-crown, 2 half-pennies and a 6 pence. So he took the 6 pence, put the purse carefully back and went out. The next day, when she wanted to pay the greengrocer, she looked in the purse for her 6 pence and her heart sank to her shoes. Then she sat down and thought, was there a 6 pence? I hadn't spent it, had I? And I hadn't left it anywhere else. So here we see that Mrs. Morel was in a fix. What to do? That is, what happened to the 6 pence? She was wounded. That is, she was much put about. She hunted round everywhere for it, and as she sought, The conviction came into her heart that her husband had taken it. What she had in her purse was all the money she possessed, but that he should sneak it from her thus was unbearable. He had done so twice before. The first time she had not accused him, and at the weekend he had put the shilling again into her purse. So that was how she had known he had taken it. The second time he had not paid back, and this time she felt it was too much. When he had had his dinner, he came home early that day. She said to him coldly, "Did you take sixpence out of my purse last night?" "Me?" he said, looking up in an offended way. "No, I did not. I never clapped eyes on your purse." So you see, Mr. Morel or Walter Morel is saying no. That is, he didn't confess his guilt that he had taken the money. He had taken the sixpence. "Me," he said, looking up in the offended way. "No, I did not. I never clapped eyes on your purse." But she could detect the lie. "Why, you know you did," she said quietly. "I tell you I did not," he shouted. "Here at me again, here. I have heard about enough on it." "So you fling sixpence out of my purse while I am taking the clothes in." "I'll make repair for this," he said, pushing back his chair in desperation. He bustled and got washed, then went determinedly upstairs. Presently he came down, dressed, and with a big bundle in a blue checked enormous handkerchief. So, my dear students, you see that the quarrel between Mr. and Mrs. Morel was going on through chapter 2 of part 1 of the novel Sons and Lovers. And after the quarrel, this time Mr. Morel went back. That is, he is saying, "Hey, I don't know, he has taken a bundle in the blue handkerchief and says he is not coming back." That is, this time he went away saying that he won't come back. And "What shall we do?" cried the boy. "Hey, never trouble, he won't go far. But if he doesn't come back?" wailed Annie. That is, the children of Mr. and Mrs. Morel are very much worried about their father. That is, if he would not come, what will happen? What would happen to them? So, and she and William returned to the sofa and wept. Mrs. Morel sat and laughed. So we see that the children were crying, but Mrs. Morel sat and laughed. "Why? You know," she exclaimed, "you pair of garbage, you will see him before the night's out." So, because Mrs. Morel was sure that Mr. Morel, that is her husband, will come back before the night's out. Okay. And here we see that, but the children are not to be consoled. Twilight came on. Mrs. Morel grew anxious from very weariness. One part of her said it would be a relief to see the last of him. Another part fretted because of keeping the children, and inside her, as yet, she could not quite let him go. At the bottom, she knew very well he could not go. So, you see, Mr. and Mrs. Morel, though she knew her husband must come home, she was also very much anxious of the matter. If he won't come, what would happen to them? So, my dear students, here we see that Mrs. Morel sat waiting. He had not any money, she knew. So, if he stopped, he was running up a bill. She was very tired of him. Tired to death. He had not even the courage to carry his bundle beyond the yard end. And the last para of this chapter 2, here we see that Mr. Morel came home at last, and whereupon he got up and went out of the house, returning presently and crossing the kitchen with averted face, hurrying upstairs. As Mrs. Morel saw him slink quickly through the inner doorway, holding his bundle, she laughed to herself, but her heart was bitter because she had loved him. My dear students, that's the ending point of part 1, chapter 2 of the novel Sons and Lovers, and that's all today. Now get ready to take homework. My dear students, homework for you. Question number 1, that is write a critical appreciation on part 1 chapter 2 of the novel Sons and Lovers. Write a critical appreciation on part 1 chapter 2 of the novel Sons and Lovers. And question number 2, write a short note on Mr. Heaton. Write a short note on Mr. Heaton. Then, my dear students, hope all of you will do your homework, and in our next class we will read chapter 1 part 1 chapter 3. Okay, in our next class we will read part 1 chapter 3. Till then, goodbye. Allah Hafiz. See you again in our next class. Allah Hafiz.